right. So you ready to dive into some serious policy proposals with us today?
Always up for a challenge.
Great, because this one's a doozy. We're tackling 21. Department of Labor and Related Agencies.pdf. Yeah, I know. Not exactly a catchy title, right?
You think they could use a marketing consultant over there at the Department of Labor?
Maybe. But hey, bureaucratic jargon aside, the ideas in this thing are actually pretty interesting. We're talking about labor reform, but through a conservative lens.
It's fascinating to see how a different set of values can really kind of shape how we think about work, and families, and even the economy as a whole.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today. So what does a worker-centric economy actually look like through a conservative lens? Well, this document lays out a pretty bold vision.
It really does. The overarching theme that we see here is this return to what they call the good of the family and then also the dignity of work.
Right. So getting back to those core conservative values. But they're not just talking about these abstract ideals here, are they? They get into some pretty concrete policy proposals.
Oh, absolutely. They argue that the current state of labor policy has become way too focused on work goals. Those are their words, by the way, not mine.
Right.
And that this has actually come at the expense of empowering workers and families.
Okay, so let's get specific. One of the most attention-grabbing sections of this document has to be the part about dismantling DEI initiatives.
Yeah.
They're calling for completely eliminating things like critical race theory training, even getting rid of EEO-1 data collection.
Yeah, which for those who don't know, that's the data companies collect on employee race and ethnicity.
Right.
It's a pretty strong stance. They argue that categorizing employees in this way actually works against recognizing the true diversity of the American workforce. They advocate instead for returning to a focus on individual merit and a colorblind approach to employment.
So they're basically saying that by focusing so much on DEI, it's actually creating more division, not less.
That's essentially their argument. It's a pretty provocative claim, for sure.
Yeah, it is. And it definitely reflects this broader debate that's happening right now about how we address inequality and how we promote opportunity in this country.
Right, and they believe very strongly that a focus on individual merit is really the most effective way to achieve those goals.
Interesting. Another area where they take a really strong stance is on religious freedom in the workplace. And wow, they really went there.
They did.
This is where it gets juicy. They want to see robust protections for religious employers, even if those beliefs happen to clash with other non-discrimination laws.
This section really kind of highlights that inherent tension that exists between, different values that we have in our society, right? Religious freedom versus non-discrimination. So how do you balance the right of individuals to practice their faith with the right of everyone to be treated equally in the workplace?
It's a tough one. It's like walking a tightrope, for sure. They specifically call for clarifying Title VII exemptions, which, for those who need a little bit of a history refresher, that's part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It prohibits discrimination by employers on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. But there are some exceptions written in, and this document really wants to give religious organizations more leeway in making employment decisions that are based on their beliefs.
Yeah, and it's a complex area of the law for sure, and, these proposals would likely face some legal challenges. But it really goes to show just how this document is trying to reshape the legal landscape around labor to align with a much more conservative vision of what the workplace should look like.
And speaking of hot-button issues, they also dive headfirst into the abortion debate, with a whole section dedicated to what they call pro-life measures in the workplace.
Yeah, they really want to see employers offer equal or even greater benefits for things like adoption and childbirth if they provide any type of coverage at all for abortion. It's about incentivizing certain choices.
It's definitely a bold stance to take, especially considering all of the legal battles that are happening at the state level over abortion access. I mean, this could get very messy. But they also want to expand workplace accommodations for pregnant women, which I found kind of interesting considering their stance on, on abortion.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexities of these issues and how this document is really trying to advocate for policies that are very much in line with a very specific moral and social viewpoint.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit here and talk about their ideas for actually reshaping the workplace itself. One of their more intriguing proposals is this idea of allowing workers to bank their paid time off instead of getting that overtime pay.
Yeah, it's about giving workers more flexibility, especially for those folks who are juggling work and family life, Imagine being able to take that extra time off to spend with your kids or, care for a sick family member instead of just getting a bigger paycheck.
Yeah, I can definitely see the appeal for working parents.
Yeah,
And speaking of families, they're also really big on incentivizing on-site childcare.
big time. They argue that it's really the best way to minimize the stress on working families and provide that extra support that parents really need.
And they're not just talking about, the feel-good stuff. They're actually proposing ways to make it financially feasible for employers to offer on-site childcare, which, that can be a major barrier.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to say you want to support families, but it's a whole other thing to actually put forward concrete solutions to make it easier for parents to work and raise a family.
I think that's a really important point. And they don't stop there. This next one might surprise you. They want to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to require time and a half pay for anyone working on the Sabbath.
Wow, hold on. Time and a half for Sunday work.
Sunday work. That seems like it would be a huge change for a lot of businesses, especially those in industries like retail and hospitality.
Right.
It would be massive. And it's so interesting because their reasoning for this goes beyond just, religious observance. They argue that it would encourage communal rest and allow families to spend more time together.
So it's about promoting those family values and a healthier work-life balance for everyone, not just those who observe the Sabbath for religious reasons. I can see how that would appeal to a lot of people, even those who don't consider themselves to be particularly religious.
It's true. It's a very thought-provoking proposal that really challenges our current assumptions about work and leisure in this 2047 economy that we live in.
That's a good way to put it. Speaking of challenging assumptions, this document also doesn't shy away from taking on some sacred cows in the financial world, especially when it comes to retirement savings and investing.
Oh, they're taking aim at ESG investing, calling it out for prioritizing factors other than financial returns. For those who are unfamiliar, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance.
Right.
And it's become a very popular way to invest. But this document argues that it's actually really bad for your retirement savings.
Okay, so what's the big deal with ESG investing? Why are they so against it?
They're basically claiming that it's all about pushing a political agenda instead of focusing on what really matters, which is growing your money. They're especially concerned about efforts to include ESG-focused options in the Thrift Savings Plan, which that's the retirement plan for federal employees.
Right.
They see it as a form of politicizing retirement savings.
So they're basically saying when it comes to your retirement funds, fiduciaries should be laser-focused on maximizing returns, not promoting some kind of social or environmental cause. It's about keeping politics out of investing, at least when it comes to other people's money.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They're also concerned about the growing level of investment in China.
Wow.
Given its human rights record and lack of transparency, they actually want to see those investments limited or even prohibited altogether.
That's a pretty strong stance to take, especially considering how intertwined the global economy is these days. It seems like they're advocating for a more America-first approach to investing, prioritizing American interests and values above global ones.
You hit the nail on the head. This section really underscores their belief that financial decisions should be based solely on economic factors, not some sort of political ideology.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with this document. From dismantling DEI to promoting family-friendly policies to taking on ESG investing. It's clear that they are not shying away from controversial topics. But what about the workers themselves? How do they actually propose to give them a stronger voice, especially in a system where, traditional unions seem to be losing their grip?
That's where things get really interesting. They actually come right out and criticize traditional unions, arguing that their adversarial approach just isn't resonating with most workers anymore.
Wow, even unions are getting called out in this thing. So what's their alternative? How do you give workers a voice without relying on that old union model?
Well, they propose creating something called Employee Involvement Organizations, or EIOs for short.
EIOs?
EIOs. I think of it as a more cooperative model of worker representation. They would work directly with management to address workplace issues, but the focus here is on collaboration rather than confrontation.
So more of a partnership than this us versus them mentality.
Precisely. It's a very different dynamic.
It is. And here's the kicker. They suggest that these EIOs at large corporations could even have a representative on the company's board of directors. Hold on, a worker on the board. Now that's a pretty radical idea.
That's right. It would be a pretty significant shift in corporate governance, for sure. And it could potentially give workers a much stronger voice in how companies are run.
Of course, the devil is in the details, How would these EIOs be formed? Would companies be required to create them? The document doesn't really get into those specifics. Right, it's more about outlining the broad strokes of their vision. And it's a vision that definitely challenges a lot of conventional wisdom about labor relations.
Absolutely. This is about fundamentally rethinking how workers are represented and how their voices are actually heard in the workplace. It's interesting how this document ties worker representation together with their stance on immigration. It's like they're saying, hey, let's redefine how American workers have a voice, and, oh, by the way, let's rethink who those workers actually are.
You're really hitting on something there. We can't talk about a worker-centric economy without addressing the immigration question. And this document certainly doesn't shy away from it.
No, they don't. They have some pretty strong opinions about how immigration policy impacts American workers, especially when it comes to those temporary worker programs, the H-2A and H-2B visas.
Right, the H-2A for agricultural work and the H-2B for other seasonal jobs. What's their take on those? Are they saying those programs are putting American workers at a disadvantage?
That's exactly their argument. They're calling for both of those programs to be phased out. They claim they undercut American workers and drive wages down. Like, imagine you're a farmer who relies on that H-2A program to bring in seasonal workers, especially during those busy harvest times. And this document suggests that by phasing out those programs, it'll force those farmers to offer higher wages to attract American workers instead.
Okay, so less competition from foreign workers should theoretically lead to better pay for Americans. But wouldn't phasing out those visa programs have huge ripple effects on certain industries? I mean, what about all those industries that rely so heavily on seasonal labor, like agriculture or tourism? Wouldn't it hurt those sectors of the economy?
That's the big question, isn't it? And to be fair, the document does acknowledge this alternative view that's held by some conservatives. They argue that those programs are actually beneficial, like they fill jobs that Americans just simply aren't willing to do, especially those really difficult and sometimes even dangerous jobs that are out there in the agricultural industry. If there aren't enough people willing to do those jobs, to pick the strawberries or work in those processing plants, those industries might really struggle to function, which could potentially lead to higher prices for consumers down the road.
Right, it's that whole supply and demand issue at play. And like you said, it's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. It's definitely not as simple as just saying America first and cutting off all foreign workers. There are very real economic consequences that we have to consider. But this document seems to be advocating for a much firmer stance on this. This idea of prioritizing American workers above all else.
Absolutely. And that America First approach extends to federal contracts as well. They're proposing that all new federal contracts actually require a very high percentage of a company's employees to be U.S. citizens.
So if you want to do business with the government, you better have a mostly American workforce, or else. That seems like it would be a tough sell for some companies, especially in industries where there are already labor shortages.
It could be. This section of the document really highlights that ongoing debate about what exactly is the role of government when it comes to regulating the labor market. How do you balance the needs of American workers with the needs of businesses, especially in a globalized economy?
It's a tough question to answer. There's no easy solution. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with this document, from dismantling DEI to promoting those family-friendly policies, rethinking worker representation, taking on ESG investing, and now tackling this whole immigration issue. Feels like we've gone through the entire political playbook. Is there anything else we need to tackle in this labor reform marathon?
Don't worry, we're not quite done yet. This document is surprisingly comprehensive. We still need to unpack their ideas for reforming unemployment insurance and pensions.
Okay, let's talk unemployment insurance then.
Yeah.
What kind of changes do they have in mind for that? Are they talking about making it harder to get on unemployment? Or maybe reducing the benefits that people receive?
It's interesting, they're not necessarily advocating for those specific changes. They're really focused on two main things. Number one is restoring program integrity and accountability. And number two is giving states more flexibility in how they actually administer those benefits.
Okay, so walk me through that. What exactly do they mean by restoring program integrity? It sounds a little vague.
Well, they're really concerned about fraud, especially in the wake of the pandemic. Remember, there was a huge spike in unemployment claims back then, and there were a lot of reports about fraudulent activity. They really want to make it much harder for people to cheat the system.
That makes sense. I remember reading all those stories about people scamming those unemployment systems during the pandemic. Some were even using stolen identities. So what's their solution for cracking down on fraud?
Well, for starters, they propose giving the Labor Department's Inspector General more power to investigate and access state unemployment records. And they also want to require states to cross-check unemployment applicants with these national databases to prevent people from receiving benefits in multiple states, benefits they're not actually entitled to.
So basically cutting down on all that bureaucratic red tape and making it a lot harder to game the system. It sounds like they're trying to strike a balance here, providing that safety net for those who truly need it, while at the same time preventing abuse of the system. But what about this idea of giving states more flexibility with unemployment benefits? How would that work in practice?
This is where things get really interesting. They're suggesting that states should actually have the option to allow non-public organizations to administer those unemployment benefits.
Wait, really? So instead of just being run by the government, private organizations could get involved in managing unemployment? That's a pretty radical departure from how things are typically done.
It is, and it really reflects a broader conservative principle here, empowering private sector solutions and reducing reliance on that government bureaucracy. They believe that by introducing more competition and innovation into the system, you can actually improve efficiency and better serve the needs of both workers and employers. Like, imagine a scenario where instead of having to deal with this really slow-moving government agency, you could file for unemployment through this streamlined online platform managed by a private company instead.
It's a pretty big shift in thinking, for sure. I'd be really interested to see how that would actually play out in reality. Would private companies be more efficient? Or would it become like a race to the bottom, with all these companies trying to cut costs and offer less support to those unemployed workers? A lot to consider there.
Definitely. It speaks to this larger philosophical debate that we have in this country about the role of government versus the private sector in providing essential services.
Okay, so we tackled unemployment insurance. What about pensions? What's their take on those?
Well, they're particularly interested in addressing the challenges faced by those multi-employer pension plans. Those are really common in industries like trucking and construction, where you have all these workers who might hold jobs with multiple employers over their careers.
I've heard about those multi-employer plans being in a lot of trouble. What's the issue there? Why do they need reforming?
Essentially, they've been plagued by underfunding and mismanagement, which has left many workers facing a very uncertain retirement. You can imagine the stress and the anxiety that this is causing for folks who worked hard their entire lives, only to find out that the pension they were counting on might not actually be there for them when they need it. This document is calling for some pretty significant reforms to address those issues.
So what's the solution? Give me the nitty-gritty details. How do you even begin to fix a system that seems so fundamentally flawed?
Well, one of their main proposals is to align the rules for these multi-employer plans more closely with the rules that govern single-employer plans.
Okay.
The idea is to impose much stricter funding requirements and greater transparency to safeguard those workers' retirement savings.
Less wiggle room for those plans to play fast and loose with people's money.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
It's about protecting people's hard-earned retirement savings.
Yes, it's hard to argue with that.
And it ties back to their whole emphasis on individual responsibility and self-reliance. They want to make sure workers are protected from those risky or unsustainable pension schemes. But they also want to encourage individuals to really take ownership of their own retirement planning.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of retirement savings, what about the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, or the PBGC, as it's known in government circles? That's the agency that steps in to protect pensions when things go belly up, right?
That's right. The PBGC is essentially like an insurance program for those private sector pensions.
Right.
And this document argues that it also needs some pretty serious reforms.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Like, what's wrong with the PBGC, and how do they propose to fix it?
They're concerned about the lack of transparency and accountability, especially since the PBGC has been submitting those required reports late and even using outdated data. Imagine being a policymaker trying to make important decisions about a critical safety net program without accurate or up-to-date information.
That just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically want to shine a light on the PBGC's operations, make sure they're being held accountable for how they're managing this crucial safety net for retirees.
Precisely. They want to see much more accurate and timely financial reporting from the agency so Congress can actually have a much clearer picture of its financial health. They're also calling for the PBGC to take a much more proactive approach in addressing those underfunded multi-employer pension plans.
So basically stepping in and taking action before those plans crash and burn. That seems like a much more responsible approach than just waiting for things to fall apart and then having to bail everyone out.
Precisely. They argue that the PBGC's previous reluctance to actually use its authority has contributed to this current pension crisis. They really want to see the agency being much more assertive in protecting workers and retirees from losing their hard-earned pensions.
It sounds like they're really trying to overhaul that entire retirement security system, from strengthening those multi-employer plans to really reforming the PBGC.
Absolutely. They want to make sure that the safety net is strong, that's reliable, but they also want to ensure that the system itself is fair and sustainable for those future generations.
It really does seem like they're trying to overhaul the entire labor landscape with these proposals here.
Yeah.
From worker representation and benefits to retirement security and immigration, it's a lot to digest.
It is. This document presents a very comprehensive vision for labor policy through that conservative lens. And while it doesn't necessarily provide all the answers, it certainly sparks a lot of really important questions about how we can actually create a labor market that works for everyone.
You know, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from completely reshaping worker representation to figuring out how to revamp retirement security. I feel like we've talked about everything under the sun. But there's one final piece of the puzzle I want to make sure we don't miss. And that's international labor policy.
Ah, yes, of course.
Yeah.
How does this conservative vision for American workers actually fit into this whole globalized economy we're living in? Something that a lot of folks are trying to figure out these days.
Exactly. With jobs and supply chains spanning continents, it's like we're playing a whole new ball game.
Yeah.
So how does this document suggest we level the playing field for American workers when they're competing in a global economy?
It really all comes down to trade. They point to the USMCA, that's the trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada as a model for future trade deals. Remember that replaced the old NAFTA agreement?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's so special about the USMCA's labor provisions? What makes them the gold standard in the eyes of this document?
Well, they highlight a few key things. First, it aims to eliminate forced labor, which is, unfortunately still a reality in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
Second, it actually protects workers' rights to organize and join unions without facing retaliation, which is a really big deal when it comes to worker empowerment. And then third, it sets up the system for investigating labor violations much more quickly, not letting these things drag on forever.
So it's basically trying to make sure that companies in those other countries, Mexico and Canada, are playing by the same rules as companies here in the U.S., at least when it comes to how they're treating their workers.
Exactly. And they argue that these same principles should be applied to any new trade agreements that the U.S. enters into. They're also calling for much greater transparency in those global supply chains. The idea being that, if you go to the store and you buy a product that was made in, let's say, Vietnam, you should be able to easily find out if the workers who made that product were treated fairly or not.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, those hidden abuses in some far-off factory shouldn't be giving those companies an unfair advantage, right? But actually monitoring labor practices in all these different countries all over the world, that just seems like a massive undertaking. Like, how on earth do they think we can realistically achieve that?
Well, they really want to see the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs to really step up its game when it comes to investigating those labor violations. But it's not about trying to police the entire world. Instead, they're saying, let's be much more strategic here. Let's target our efforts where they'll have the biggest impact on American workers.
So instead of trying to police the entire world, they're saying, let's be more targeted and focus our energy where it matters most.
Exactly. It's about making sure that trade is actually fair and beneficial for everyone involved, not just those big corporations.
Well, I have to say, this has been quite a journey. We've explored a very specific vision for the future of work, a conservative vision, one that touches on pretty much every aspect of the workplace, from how we hire and fire people to retirement security to even international trade. It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It really is. This document doesn't shy away from those complex issues. And while it doesn't necessarily offer all the answers or solutions, it definitely provides a valuable framework for thinking about how we create a much more worker-centric economy that benefits everyone.
Absolutely. So as we come to the end of our deep dive here, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
For me, it's that real emphasis on empowering workers and families, but doing so through a different lens than we might be used to. This document really challenges us to rethink the role of government, the very nature of work, and how we balance all these different competing values in this rapidly changing world.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's a call to action, this document. urging us to engage in this really thoughtful debate about how we can create a future of work that truly benefits everyone.
And that's exactly what we've tried to do today, to unpack these really complex ideas, spark your curiosity, and maybe even challenge some of your own assumptions along the way.
Well said. And to all of our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you plenty to ponder. Remember, the future of work is something that we create together. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those questions coming.